Several weeks ago I did a video on building this small diorama to show off some die-cast tractors I own. In that video I hinted at the end that I was working on a Mad Max themed diorama and would be posting a video on it. And well, here we are. If you have not seen the original video, I recommend watching it first, as I'll be assuming that you've seen it and won't be re-explaining everything here that I went over in that video. Also, if you like these type of videos and for some reason have not already subscribed to Luke Towan, then you have some great binge watching in your future. I'll leave a link to his channel below, so check it out and subscribe if you haven't already. Last, I shot most of this video footage with a camera I have since decided not to use anymore. I've come up with a better way to do these overhead type videos using a better camera, so please excuse some of the poor video quality of this video. I did the best that I could cleaning it up within the limits of the video software I use. Alright, so let's get started. Just like in the previous base video, I'll cut out a circle with my laser cutter and then cover it with some paper clay just as before. I want a larger scene this time, so the circle I cut is much bigger to provide more real estate for more items to be placed. Also, you can buy pre-cut circles and squares at many hobby stores if you don't want to cut them out yourself. Once the paper clay dries, I'll cover it with some Mod Podge using a brush. I'll then cover the base with sand. I'm using aquarium sand as it tends to be extremely fine and you get a choice of several different colors, but any sand will do. I find that one coat will never do. Typically, I have to repeat the Mod Podge and sand coating a couple times until all the clay is covered. I want to form a sort of rocky valley with a road going in between. I picked up some pre-made plaster rocks from the hobby store that are the correct scale and should work great. I'll pre-position the rocks and my car in the scene to be sure everything fits. Once I'm happy with the placement, I'll glue the rocks in with some PVA glue. I will then set everything aside to dry. I've done a couple cars in the past that are a marriage of wheels and guns. Here I want to create a scene that reflects something a little bit different. I want to look at a situation where the car breaks down in the middle of the wasteland far from help and rescue. What would a human do in that situation? Would you leave the car with as much as you could carry? Or would you stay knowing that you have lots of supplies in the car, but knowing that this would probably be the place that you would die? Sort of a thought experiment, and you're welcome to talk about what you would do in this situation in the comments below. In this scene, the two people will decide to stay with their supplies to the end. I plan to set the scene up in a way that shows what has happened many years in the future. I'll be taking some artistic liberties here and there. For example, I won't cover the car completely in sand as you might expect to happen in a real Mad Max world. So while I wait for the glue to set up, I'll go ahead and start working on the car. I'll be using a Ford Ranchero for my Mad Max car. Of course, the first thing I'll do is take the car apart. I will then use a sharp metal object like this awl to puncture through the paint into the metal below. These holes will be turned into bullet holes that you'll be able to see better later. Once I have placed all my bullet holes, I'll drop the car in some iron chloride solution. This will eat away at the metal but leave the paint areas unharmed. I find this to be a good way to put in realistic bullet holes that are close to scale. After about 5 minutes in the solution, I'll pull the car out and wash it off and allow it to dry. I'll then move to using a burr bit on my Dremel to put some dents in the car. I'm going to put quite a few in the roof to imply that the car might have flipped over a time or two, and a bunch in the back to look as if it was rear-ended. When done, I'll re-dip the car in iron chloride solution to eat away at the areas that I used the Dremel, and then I'll remove the paint. Last, I'll dip the car a final time in the etchant to get a super rusty look all over the car. So a lot of back and forth in the iron chloride to achieve a really rusty and aged look. That will be the base layer that I'll start with. You may have noticed I painted the underside of the car. This was to keep the etching solution from eating away at the metal in this area. It's not required or anything, but it does help to keep the drilled out post in good shape for when I put the car back together. Now it's time to start working with some weathering powders. If you have watched any of my older videos, you've seen me use these many times before. The darker weathering powder represents older rust, and the lighter, more orange colored powder represents fresh rust. When I apply the weathering powders, you might think that I'm overdoing it, but I still have to clear coat over the powders, and when you do that, it really dulls the effect down. Since I want this car to look really rusty, then I need to go a little overboard, knowing that the clear coat will take it back several steps. Here I've clear coated over the powder. Hopefully you can see how much it takes it back. I've done most of the rust weathering on the body at this point, but want to work on some of the bullet holes. Right now they blend into the car, so to make them pop, I'll dip my awl in black acrylic paint and then spin the awl inside each of the bullet holes. This will allow some of the paint to rub off and make the bullet holes more pronounced and noticeable than before. At this point the base is dry and I can move on to adding some other details. You'll notice that I added some dead grass around the base of the rocks. To see how this is done, please check out my last diorama video. I picked up some desert plants, cactus and such, from the hobby store. These will add some small amount of color to the diorama, especially around the rocks, and I plan to have some of the cactus growing through the cracks of the rock. The Mad Max world is a pretty dead world, especially in Fury Road. I believe they filmed most of that movie in a national park in Namibia, which is pretty devoid of plant life. The Mel Gibson movies, however, were filmed in Australia, and you can see much more plant life in those films. I want to turn my attention now to the car's base. I won't be using the original wheels, so I'll remove them by cutting off the plastic tabs that hold the axles in place. I recently purchased a UV LCD resin 3D printer that I love, the Anycubic Photon. When I started this project, the printer was new to me and I was getting used to using it. I've since printed hundreds of items on it and plan to do a video showing how I use it to make really small detailed parts for customs. But at the time I was filming this, the printer was very new and I was still getting used to using it, so I didn't want to go into how to use it until I knew what I was doing. So expect a video on that in the future. For now though, I had created some steel rims in Tinkercad and then printed them off on the printer. For the axle, I just used some brass rod and glue the rims on the axle. Once the glue sets, I'll then use my weathering powders to rust them out and age them. I can then clear coat them and set them aside to dry. For the interior, I painted it black and then used a much lighter weathering powder to dust it up. The car would have been sitting with the windows open for many years, so I doubt I could really go overboard given how much dirt and dust would have accumulated in that time. So here's the car with the base put back on. Hopefully you can see the bullet holes now. The rims need to be toned down a little so that they don't stand out as much, but I can fix that later. I'm happy with the weathering as far as the body is concerned, so I'll go ahead and start adding details. I'm going for a little different look here compared to cars I've done in the past. Instead of building a war machine, I decided I wanted to go for a more of a survivalist prepper type. This gives me a lot of options as far as details go. Since this car has a bed, I can fill it up with items that a survivalist family might have if they were traveling the wasteland. This would include barrels of water, jerry cans of fuel, crates and other storage containers, and of course hand weapons for protection. And for hunting. Lizards, I guess. It's best not to think where one might get subsistence in this world. Anyway, all these items will be 3D printed on the Anycubic Photon. Most of the 3D models I found on sites like Thingiverse just by searching for that item. A few I made in Tinkercad. I'm amazed at how small some of these items can be and the printer has no issue printing them. The rifles I printed, for example, are detailed and are actually in scale, something I could never do with my normal 3D printer. I found the easiest way to paint these items is to use some double-sided tape on a popsicle stick. I could then stick on the small parts and then hand paint them or airbrush them like I did the spare tire. Once they dry, I need to weather them using washes and rust and dust powders. For the items like the crate, I'll also do some dry brushing to give them age and highlight their details. After all the items dry, I'll begin placing them in the bed of the car. My father used to own one of these Ford Rancheros and hated it. He bought it thinking he'd be getting both a car and a truck. What he found was the opposite. When he needed a car to haul the family around, he couldn't use it as there was not enough room. And when he wanted a truck to haul some dirt or wood, he couldn't use it because, well, it's a car, and it's easy to overload it. As such, even today, he feels it was the most useless car ever made. That being said, I'm sure he still wishes he had it. I bring this up only to state that I doubt this car could actually hold all these items without serious upgrades to the rear suspension. I'll assume that these modifications were made to this car in the wasteland. But it would probably not be the best option to use in the real wasteland given gas mileage, ground clearance, all those sorts of things, but maybe it's all they had. For the windshield, I'll be replacing the glass with some brass sheeting that I cut slots into then bent up to make louvers. This would allow the driver to see out the front of the car and also offer up some defense, at least a small arms fire from people shooting down from canyon walls and such. Once the brass is cut to fit, I'll weather it with some rust powders and then glue it into place with some superglue. Other defenses like spikes would be desirable, but you'd have to weigh the cost of carrying around all that extra weight to the odds of getting attacked in a way that the spikes would be useful. It's more likely people would be shooting at you compared to actually jumping on your car. Jumping on moving cars is a Hollywood thing. Doing that in real life would probably get you killed 99% of the time. With the windshield in place, I can go ahead and put the car together, but before I do, I want to give it a driver. The skeleton was printed on the 3D printer and gives you an idea of how small the parts can be. To put it in place, I'll first need to break its legs off, and then I can glue it into the driver's seat. Next, I want to put in a road. This is done by using a weathering powder that is slightly darker or lighter than the ground color. Since the sand I use is rather light, I decided to go with a darker color. I sort of went back and forth on this as I want these people to be in a place that's not well traveled, but the road makes it feel traveled. So the road could be a mistake given the story I'm trying to build. However, it seems necessary, so I went ahead and went with it. With the road in, I will temporarily place the car on the base and then make a mark with a brush. I want to show an oil spill, like something major happened to the car and it's now leaking oil. The oil in this case is just Known Oil Wash by Citadel. Once I have the oil in place, I will glue the car to the base to keep it from moving around. Now that the car is in place, I can start adding on other details. First up, I'll glue in another skeleton leaning up against the car. Same as the first, I broke the legs off and then glued the legs onto the base. Next, I'll glue on one of the rifles to his lap. I'll then break his right leg and leave both pieces next to one another. This will act as a clue as to what happened here. Moving a bit over, I'll glue in some logs that will represent a campfire. These are just small twigs I broke off from a branch outside. I'm not sure where he got wood from, but maybe he broke his leg while trying to scavenge it. I'll then use an airbrush to make the campfire seem like it's been used. Right next to him, I'll glue in one of the crates to act as a table. While I wait for all this to cure, I'll play around with some HO scale campsite items I bought from a hobby store. The only thing I ended up using was the backpack. I glued it to the ground next to the car. When I had posted pictures of my progress on Instagram, several people had mentioned I should place some glass bottles around the campsite. That seemed like a great idea, so I printed off some bottles and then glued them into different places around the site, making sure to drop one in his lap. One of the last large features I decided to add was a tent or someplace he would sleep. To make this, I'll use some shaved leather. I like to use the leather instead of cloth as it's easy to form into shapes when wet and has no real pattern that would look out of scale. Also, one of the nice things about using leather is that it can easily be dyed any color by just soaking it in the paint you want to use. Last, I'll bend one corner over to make a triangle shape, and then set the leather aside to dry. Once it's dry, I'll glue it to the base and the car, and then glue an extra gas tank on top of it. This will look like the gas tank was filled with sand and then used to hold the corner of the tent in place on top of the car. Since I'm working on the hood, I'll go ahead and add a few other details, like this leg bone and another glass bottle. The hood makes a good place for him to prepare his meals. And then finally I'll go over all the parts of the model with some weathering powder to make everything look as if it's been sitting in this state for some time. Once I have the weathering powder in place, I consider this diorama done, at least for now. Yeah, you can always keep going on this type of thing, adding and subtracting details. I know a few minutes after posting this video, someone will post a comment about something I forgot, and I'll facepalm and ask myself how I missed that, but I can always add it later. There are a few mistakes here and there. I didn't put tires on the hubs. I don't think the tires would have rotted away in this time. Also, my skeleton next to the car is missing clothes, and that also probably would not have rotted away. I didn't do clothing for him because of scale. I tried making some strips of cloth out of cloth and leather. They just didn't look right, so I just left him without clothes for now. It's hard to really capture the small scale of this thing. Watching the video, you're zoomed way in and can see every detail, but holding it in my hand, I need glasses to see everything. As far as the story goes, these two were kicked out of a larger camp as a way to reduce the number of mouths to feed. They packed up their Ford Ranchero and took the long walk. I'm sure you can guess as to the rest of the story. I left a lot of hints. So below, let us know what you think happened to these two based on the evidence you see here. The person who gets the most upvotes for their story in 2 weeks, I'll send this diorama to. Well, as always, please let me know your thoughts below. Thanks for putting up with the less than stellar camera footage for this video. You won't have to do that again. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.